Charleroi, lining up along the river Sambre. The fighting swelled to a roar all the way down the line into Alsace. And now another element was coming into play, the British Expeditionary Force. For once in British history, an army was taking the field with incredible efficiency. At all the depot towns and barracks, there was tremendous activity. 60% of these men were reservists, summoned back to the colours by telegram, by public notice, even by town crier. Uniforms and rifles were issued, kits were made up, transport was prepared. New boots were fitted to feet which had lost the feel of hard army leather. 1,800 special trains carried the British Expeditionary Force to its ports of embarkation. On one day alone, 80 trains ran into Southampton docks. An average of 50,000 tons of shipping per day, safe and unhindered under the protection of the Royal Navy, carried the Expeditionary Force to France. Landings began in deep secrecy on August the 7th. The commander-in-chief of this army was Field Marshal Sir John French. Peppery, emotional, a good cavalry tactician, but not an intellectual soldier, French's task in those closing days of August was difficult enough to tax a genius. Sir John French believed that he was about to take part in a vast Allied advance to the Rhine. Of what had happened to the French or of what the Germans were doing, he knew nothing. The first thing he had to do was to make contact with the French general on his right, General Lanzac.
News had just come in that the German armies were making for a place on the Meuse called Huy, H-U-Y. It's a very difficult word to pronounce in English. And French started off gallantly in French, Lieutenant Lanzac, and said, what do you think, qu'est-ce que vous croyez que les Allemands vont faire à? What do you think the Germans are going to do at? And then he stuck H-U-Y, and just couldn't pronounce Huy. So after a moment's hesitation, he said triumphantly, Hoi! What are the Germans going to do at Hoi? And the Frenchman said, what's he say? What's he say? And then, very rudely, Lanzac turned to somebody and said, tell the Field Marshal the Germans have come to the Meuse to fish.
It was a bad beginning. Worse was to follow. Each day, the RFC flew its reconnaissances. Some discovered nothing, but one, scouting over the battlefield of Waterloo, just south of Brussels, was more fortunate.
We found the whole area completely covered with hordes of field grey uniforms and heavy stuff, transport, guns, and what have you, coming towards us. In fact, it looked as though the place was alive with the Germans.
The pilot landed and was rushed off to tell Sir John French what he had seen.
And I showed him a map all marked out. He said, have you been over that area? And I said, yes, sir. And I explained what I'd seen, and they were enormously interested, and then they began reading the figures that I'd estimated, whereupon I seemed to feel that their interest faded. They seemed to look at each other and shrug their shoulders. And then French turned round to me and said, now, yes, my boy, this is terribly interesting, but tell me all about an airplane. What can you do when you're in these machines? Aren't they very dangerous? Are they very cold? Can you see anything? What do you do if your engine stops and all that sort of stuff? And I couldn't bring him back to earth because obviously he wasn't interested. And then I again tried, and he looked at me and he said, yes, this is very interesting what you've got, but you know, our information, which of course is correct, proves that you really, I don't think you could really have seen as much as you think. Well, of course, I quite understand, you may imagine you have, but it's not the case.
But the French on the right knew all about this and were falling back at the very moment when the British believed that they were advancing. It was a bad moment for Lieutenant Spears, whose duty was liaison between the two armies.
I knew that the British Army was absolutely relying on this advance to complete its own movement. And the position of the British Army was extremely dangerous because we believed that a couple of German army corps were moving quite unopposed round the flank of the VEF, which was on the extreme left of the whole Allied line. Well, I, that is, a young officer, had come to tell, on my own responsibility, come to tell Sir John French that he couldn't rely on the French advance. And indeed, that if he continued advancing as he was planning to do, it was the destruction of the whole of the British Army. We were walking straight into the mouth of a trap, enormous trap.
The dream of advancing through Belgium was at an end. From here onwards, it would be all harsh reality. The date was August the 22nd. The position which the army reached was the battlefield of Mons.